The Case of the Frozen Snowman, a Hamish Macbeth mystery. Good evening, my friends. My name is Stephen, and welcome to Mindful Musings. I invite you to pour yourself a warm drink, wrap yourself in comfort, and settle in for tonight's tale. We return once more to the Highlands, to the village of Lochdubh, where snow blankets the mountains and secrets hide in plain sight. Tonight, I'll be sharing a story through the eyes of our dear friend, Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, a man who understands that in small villages the truth often wears many faces. Our mystery begins with joy, a children's snowman contest at the village kirk, and ends with a discovery that will shake Lochdubh to its foundations. So, are you ready for a Highland mystery? If you enjoy these tales of detection and deduction, I hope you'll subscribe to Mindful Musings and join me on future journeys. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The morning after the blizzard. The blizzard had come down from the north with the fury of an ancient Highland curse, battering Lochdubh for 3 days straight. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at his kitchen window on the fourth morning, watching the sun break through the clouds like a benediction. The village lay buried under 2 feet of snow, transformed into something from a Christmas card, all soft edges and sparkling white. His dog, Lugs, pressed his nose against the glass, leaving a smudge that Hamish would have to clean later. The peculiar beast, with his mismatched ears and independent spirit, seemed as eager as Hamish to venture out into the transformed landscape. The silence after the storm was profound, broken only by the distant sound of snow sliding from roofs and the cheerful shouts of children already out building snowmen. Hamish sipped his tea and considered the day ahead. The roads would need checking, elderly residents would need visiting to ensure they had supplies, and no doubt someone would have a complaint about a neighbour's snow removal technique. Such were the demands of policing a Highland village, demands that suited him far better than the chaos of city detective work that his superiors kept trying to promote him into. His mobile phone rang, and he saw it was Reverend Macpherson. Hamish, the minister's voice came through with barely contained excitement. The Kirk session has decided to go ahead with the children's snowman-building contest. We've got perfect conditions, and the bairns have been cooped up for days. Would you be willing to serve as one of the judges? Hamish smiled despite himself. The annual snowman contest was a Lochdubh tradition, though usually held in January rather than December. This year's early blizzard had simply moved up the schedule. When is it to be, Reverend? This afternoon at 2 o'clock in the Kirk garden. We'll have hot chocolate and shortbread after, courtesy of Mrs. Wellington. She's already been baking since dawn. That settled it. Mrs. Wellington's shortbread could lure Hamish into almost anything. I'll be there, he said. Who else is judging? Dr. Brodie and Miss Halliburton from the primary school. We thought 3 judges would be fair. The children are already gathering snow. I've never seen such enthusiasm. After the call ended, Hamish dressed warmly and ventured out with Lugs. The Land Rover started reluctantly in the cold, coughing like an old man with bronchitis, before settling into a reliable rumble. He drove slowly through the village, checking on the elderly and making sure the main road had been cleared. Mrs. Mackenzie waved from her window, her cats visible as dark shapes on the sill behind her. Angus MacNeil was already out setting snares in the woods, a habit Hamish chose to overlook as long as Angus kept to rabbits and stayed off other people's property. By noon, Hamish had satisfied himself that the village had weathered the storm without serious incident. A few minor power outages, some frozen pipes at the Napoli restaurant, but nothing that couldn't be managed. He stopped at Patel's shop to pick up some supplies, and found the shopkeeper in an unusually agitated state. Have you heard? Mr. Patel was saying to a cluster of villagers. Duncan Ross was seen in Lochdubh just before the storm hit. That developer from Strathbane. The man wants to buy the Kirk grounds and turn them into holiday flats. Can you imagine? Holiday flats where our children play and our ancestors are buried. Hamish felt his stomach tighten. He knew Duncan Ross by reputation, a property developer with a talent for finding loopholes in planning regulations and a complete disinterest in local sentiment. If Ross had his eye on the Kirk grounds, it meant trouble for Lochdubh. Where is he staying? Hamish asked. Not at the hotel, surely. Mr. Patel shook his head. No one knows. He was seen driving through during the blizzard, but then nothing. Perhaps he made it to Strathbane before the roads closed, Or perhaps he's holed up somewhere waiting out the storm. The Curry sisters, twins of indeterminate age and infinite nosiness, chimed in with their usual mixture of gossip and judgment. We saw his car, a black BMW, parked near the kirk on the first night of the storm. Nessie Curry declared. Vanity, trying to do business during a blizzard. Vanity, her sister Jessie echoed, as she always did. Hamish filed this information away and continued his rounds. At 2:00, he arrived at the kirk garden to find it transformed into a wonderland of snow sculptures. 15 children had entered the contest, their efforts ranging from traditional three-ball snowmen to ambitious attempts at snow animals and fairy tale characters. The children themselves were red-cheeked and bright-eyed, bouncing with excitement as the judges began their inspection. Dr. Brodie, a practical man who prescribed whiskey for most ailments, took his judging duties seriously. Miss Halliburton, a young teacher new to Lochdubh, made careful notes about each entry. Hamish simply enjoyed the creativity on display, from young Timmy Patterson's attempt at a snow dragon to the Morrison twins' matching snowmen, dressed in their father's old scarves. But it was the entry at the far end of the garden, near the kirk wall, that took everyone's breath away. A magnificent snowman, nearly 7 feet tall, stood like a white sentinel. Its construction was masterful, the proportions perfect, the details exquisite. Someone had given it a top hat made from black card, a scarf of Campbell tartan, and arms of carefully positioned branches that seemed to gesture welcomingly. "Whose is this one?" Miss Halliburton asked, consulting her list. "That's young Robbie MacLeod's," she said with surprise. "I didn't know he had such talent." 10-year-old Robbie stepped forward, his face a mixture of pride and something else that Hamish couldn't quite identify. Nervousness, perhaps. "I worked on it all morning," the boy said. "Found the perfect spot with the deepest snow. Used the kirk wall to help pack it tight." The judges conferred briefly, but the decision was unanimous. Robbie's snowman was the clear winner. As Miss Halliburton announced the results and the children cheered, Hamish noticed Robbie didn't look as happy as he should. The boy kept glancing at his winning creation, with an expression that suggested worry rather than triumph. Mrs. Wellington appeared with trays of hot chocolate and shortbread, and the gathering became festive. Parents arrived to collect their children, admiring the snow sculptures and taking photographs. Hamish accepted a cup of chocolate and stood beside Reverend Macpherson, watching the scene with contentment. "It's good to see the children so happy," the minister said. "After being trapped indoors for 3 days, they needed this. And that winning snowman is truly remarkable. Young Robbie has a real gift." Hamish nodded, but his policeman's instincts were stirring. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, some detail that didn't fit the peaceful scene before him. He glanced again at Robbie's magnificent snowman, standing tall and proud against the kirk wall, and felt a whisper of unease he couldn't quite explain. Chapter 2. The Discovery in the Garden. The morning sun turned Robbie MacLeod's winning snowman into a gleaming sculpture that caught every eye passing by the kirk. Hamish had driven past twice already, once on his morning rounds, and again after checking on Mrs. Mackenzie's frozen pipes. Each time he'd noticed more villagers stopping to admire it, taking photographs, pointing out the clever details to their companions. It was young Alice Wellington, the minister's wife's niece visiting from Edinburgh, who made the discovery that would transform a children's competition into a police investigation. She'd been staying at the manse for a week, a city girl charmed by the Highland winter, and had developed a habit of walking the kirk grounds each morning with her camera, capturing the winter landscape, for her photography course. Hamish was in Patel's shop discussing the best way to clear the ice from the shop's entrance when his mobile phone rang. The panic in Reverend Macpherson's voice came through clearly even before the minister spoke. "Hamish, you need to come to the kirk immediately. Alice has found something terrible, in the snowman. Dear God, Hamish, there's a body inside the snowman." Hamish felt his stomach drop. He was moving before he'd fully processed the words, leaving Mr. Patel staring after him in confusion. The Land Rover's tyres struggled for purchase on the icy road as Hamish drove the short distance to the kirk, lugs sliding across the passenger seat with an aggrieved expression. A small crowd had already gathered in the kirk garden, drawn by Alice's screams and now held back by Reverend Macpherson's outstretched arms. The girl herself sat on the kirk steps, wrapped in the minister's coat, her face the colour of snow. Mrs. Wellington was beside her, rubbing her hands and speaking in soothing tones. Hamish approached the winning snowman with a growing sense of dread. From a distance it still looked like the magnificent creation that had won yesterday's contest. Up close, however, the morning sun had begun its work. The snowman's surface had developed a glassy sheen of ice, and in several places the melting had progressed enough to reveal what lay beneath. A hand. Blue-grey and frozen solid, it protruded slightly from the snowman's torso, the fingers curved as if reaching for something. Higher up, where the head should be, a patch of melted snow revealed a glimpse of dark fabric, and lower down, unmistakably, was the toe of an expensive leather shoe. Hamish's mind raced through the implications. Someone had built a body into this snowman, packed snow around a corpse with enough skill to create an award-winning sculpture. But who, and more importantly, whose body was entombed in frozen water? He pulled out his mobile and called Dr. Brodie, then Detective Chief Inspector Blair in Strathbane. Blair's response was predictably explosive. A body in a snowman? Macbeth, this is either the stupidest prank I've ever heard of, or you've finally found a way to make my life more complicated than it already is. Secure the scene. I'm sending a team, but with these roads, it'll be hours before we arrive. Hamish turned to the crowd, which had grown to include most of the village's morning population. I need everyone to step back, he said firmly. This is now a crime scene. Reverend, can you take Alice inside and get her some sweet tea? Mrs. Wellington, perhaps you could help. The minister's wife nodded and gently guided Alice toward the manse. The crowd reluctantly moved back, though Hamish could see mobile phones being raised, photographs being taken. In the age of social media, news of Lochdubh's frozen corpse would be spreading across Scotland before the Strathbane team even left their station. Hamish strung, police tape around the area, his mind working through the timeline. The snowman had been built yesterday morning by young Robbie MacLeod, but the body must have been there before Robbie started, buried in the deep snow against the kirk wall, waiting to be discovered, or hoping to remain hidden until spring. Dr. Brodie arrived, his usually cheerful face grim. He examined what was visible of the body without disturbing the snow. From what I can see, he said quietly, this person has been dead for several days. Frozen solid. The cold would have preserved the body perfectly. Time of death will be difficult to establish precisely, but I'd guess sometime during or just before the blizzard. The blizzard. Hamish remembered the Curry sisters mentioning Duncan Ross's black BMW near the kirk. He remembered Mr. Patel's comment about Ross being seen in Lochdubh and then disappearing. A property developer who wanted to turn kirk grounds into holiday flats would have enemies in this village. We need to identify the body, Hamish said, but we can't do that without more melting or without destroying evidence. Dr. Brodie nodded grimly. The Strathbane team will bring proper equipment. In the meantime, we should try to keep it as stable as possible. This sun isn't helping. Hamish found an old tarpaulin in the kirk storage shed and erected a makeshift shelter over the snowman, buying them time before the sun's work revealed more than they were ready to see. As he worked, he became aware of someone watching him intently. Young Robbie MacLeod stood at the edge of the police tape, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the snowman he'd created. "Robbie," Hamish called gently, "can you come here a moment?" The boy approached reluctantly, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked younger than his 10 years, frightened and confused. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened yesterday morning when you built your snowman," Hamish said, keeping his voice kind but firm. "Start from the beginning. Where did you get the snow?" Robbie's voice was barely above a whisper. "I came early, before the contest started. Wanted to get the best spot. That area by the kirk wall had the deepest snow, all piled up from the drifts. It was perfect. I started rolling the bottom ball, and it got so big so fast because the snow was so deep and packed. Did you notice anything unusual? Anything that seemed strange?" Hamish asked. The boy hesitated, and Hamish saw guilt flash across his young face. "There was something hard in the middle," Robbie admitted. "When I was packing the snow for the body part, the middle section. I felt something solid, but I thought it was just a rock or a log buried in the snow. It made it easier to build the snowman, actually. Gave it structure. I just kept packing snow around it. So you never actually saw what was inside? You just felt something solid? Robbie shook his head miserably. I just wanted to win the contest. I didn't know. I didn't know there was a person in there. His voice broke and tears started down his cheeks. I built my snowman around a dead person. Hamish put a hand on the boy's shoulder. You didn't know, Robbie. You didn't do anything wrong. But I need you to think carefully. Did you see anyone else near this spot before the contest? Anyone at all? The boy wiped his eyes and thought. Mr. Mackay was out early, clearing snow from the kirk steps. And I saw Miss MacLeod going into the kirk, probably to practice the organ. But that was it. Most people were still at home. Hamish filed away these names. Ian Mackay, the kirk sexton, and Moira MacLeod, the church organist. Both would have had access to the kirk grounds before and during the blizzard. His mobile phone rang. It was Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife, her voice tight with worry. Hamish, I just heard. Is it true? Is there really a body? And could it be Duncan Ross, that developer? He had an appointment with the kirk session 3 days ago, just before the blizzard hit. He never showed up, and no one's heard from him since. Hamish felt the pieces beginning to align. Where was this appointment? At the kirk? Yes, Angela said. 7 o'clock in the evening, the first night of the blizzard. The session was going to hear his proposal for developing the kirk grounds. Half the village was opposed, of course, Moira MacLeod most of all. She lives in the cottage behind the kirk, the one Ross wanted to demolish for his development. Chapter 3. The Shape of Suspicion. By early afternoon, the Strathbane team had arrived in 2 vehicles that struggled up the icy roads. Detective Chief Inspector Blair emerged from the lead car like a bull entering a ring, his face already red with cold and irritation. Behind him came Detective Jimmy Anderson, Hamish's friend and the only member of Blair's team with any sense. So, Macbeth, Blair bellowed, you've turned a children's snowman contest into a murder investigation. Only you could manage that. Where's this alleged body? Hamish led them to the tarpaulin-covered sculpture. The morning sun had continued its work despite his efforts to shade it, and more of the body was now visible. The forensics team, led by a young woman Hamish didn't recognise, immediately set up equipment and began carefully documenting and removing the snow. It took 2 hours of painstaking work before the body was fully revealed, and when it was, Hamish's suspicions were confirmed. Duncan Ross lay frozen in the attitude of someone who had died quickly, his arms slightly raised, his face twisted in an expression that might have been surprise or pain. He wore an expensive wool coat and leather shoes wholly inadequate for a Highland blizzard. The forensics lead, who introduced herself as Dr. Chen, examined the body with careful precision. Severe head trauma, she announced. Back of the skull. Likely cause of death. I'll know more after the post-mortem, but this appears to be a clear case of homicide. The body was then concealed in snow, probably immediately after death, which would have been 3 to 4 days ago based on the weather conditions. Blair was already looking at Hamish with narrow-eyed suspicion. You knew him? This Ross character? Hamish nodded. By reputation only. He was a property developer from Strathbane, had plans to develop the kirk grounds here, turn them into holiday flats. And let me guess, Blair said with heavy sarcasm, the good people of Lochdubh were opposed to this? Violent opposition, perhaps? It's a small village, sir. People care about their kirk and their heritage. But murder? That's a different matter. Blair snorted. In my experience, Macbeth, small villages are where the worst murders happen. All that community spirit hiding dark secrets. Right. I want a list of everyone who opposed this development. Everyone who had a motive to want Ross dead. As Blair stomped off to begin interviews, Jimmy Anderson pulled Hamish aside. What do you really think? Jimmy asked quietly. He was a good detective when he could stay sober, and he knew Hamish well enough to value his insights. I think someone killed Ross on the first night of the blizzard, Hamish said. Probably here at the kirk, during or after the 7 o'clock meeting with the kirk session. Then they hid the body in the snow, packing it against the kirk wall where the drifts were deepest. They were hoping it would stay buried until spring, maybe longer. But why here? Jimmy asked. Why not hide it somewhere more remote? Because the blizzard was already raging, Hamish explained. Visibility was near zero. The killer couldn't risk taking the body far. and with all that snow falling, they probably thought it would be buried deep enough to stay hidden. They didn't count on a children's snowman contest the day after the blizzard ended. Jimmy nodded slowly. So we're looking for someone who was at the kirk that night. Someone who had access and motive. That's not a very long list in a village this size. Hamish thought of Moira MacLeod, the church organist who faced eviction if Ross's development went through. He thought of Ian Mackay, the kirk sexton who'd been clearing snow early on the morning of the contest. He thought of Reverend Macpherson himself, who loved his kirk and his congregation with fierce devotion. The list might not be long, Hamish said, but everyone on it is someone I know, someone I've had tea with, someone I've helped with problems, someone I consider a neighbour. That's what makes this difficult. Welcome to police work in a small village, Jimmy said sympathetically. Come on, let's start with the kirk session. They were the ones meeting with Ross that night. The kirk session of Lochdubh consisted of 5 elders plus Reverend Macpherson. Hamish and Jimmy gathered them in the kirk hall, where Mrs. Wellington had set up tea and shortbread with the automatic hospitality that even murder couldn't suspend. The elders, all respectable citizens of long standing, looked uncomfortable and worried. Alistair Campbell, a retired banker, served as session clerk. Margaret Fraser ran the village post office. Donald Murray owned the garage. Catherine Sinclair taught at the primary school with Miss Halliburton. And James McGregor farmed sheep in the hills above Lochdubh. Reverend Macpherson began the account. Ross had requested the meeting to present his development proposal. He said it would bring prosperity to Lochdubh, create jobs, attract tourists. We met at 7 o'clock here in the Kirk Hall. And what was the reaction? Jimmy asked. We were unanimously opposed, Alistair Campbell said firmly. The Kirk grounds have been held in trust for the community since the 17th century. Holiday flats would destroy the character of the village and desecrate ground that includes our cemetery. How did Ross take this? Hamish asked. Not well, Margaret Fraser admitted. He became angry, said we were being short-sighted and backward. He claimed he'd found a legal loophole, something about the trust document being improperly filed in 1923. Said he'd take it to court if necessary. What time did the meeting end? Jimmy continued. Around 8 o'clock, Reverend Macpherson said. Ross stormed out, said he'd be back with lawyers. We stayed for another hour discussing our options. By the time we left, around 9, the blizzard was at its peak. And Ross? Where did he go? The elders exchanged glances. No one knew. He left first, James McGregor said, headed out into the storm. We assumed he'd made it to his car and driven to Strathbane or found accommodation at the hotel. But he didn't, Hamish said quietly. Somewhere between leaving this hall and reaching his car, Duncan Ross was killed and his body buried in snow not 50 feet from where we're sitting now. The silence that followed was profound. Outside, the afternoon sun continued its work on the remaining snow, revealing a landscape that would soon be muddy and brown. The winter wonderland that had hidden Duncan Ross's body was melting away, and with it perhaps the secrets of who had killed him and why. Chapter 4. The Organist's Dilemma. Moira MacLeod lived in a small stone cottage tucked behind the kirk, a dwelling that had housed church organist for nearly 100 years. It was a tidy place with a well-tended garden, though now buried under snow, and windows that looked out onto the kirk's ancient graveyard. Hamish had been there many times for tea, listening to Moira's stories about the kirk's history and her late husband, a fisherman who'd been lost at sea 15 years earlier. Now, approaching the cottage with Jimmy Anderson beside him, Hamish felt the heavy weight of duty pressing on his shoulders. Moira was 63, a woman who devoted her life to the kirk's music, who played for every service and every funeral and every wedding with the same careful dedication. She answered the door in her customary neat dress and cardigan, her grey hair pinned back, her face pale but composed. Hamish, Detective Anderson, I've been expecting you. Please come in. The cottage's interior was warm and cluttered with the comfortable disorder of someone who lived alone and pleased herself. Sheet music covered the small dining table. Books about Scottish church history lined the shelves. A framed photograph of Moira's late husband smiled from the mantelpiece. Moira made tea with steady hands, though Hamish noticed they trembled slightly as she poured. They sat in her small living room, the three of them, while Lugg settled by the fire with the contentment of a dog who'd been here many times before. "You know why we're here," Jimmy began gently. "We need to ask you about Duncan Ross and the night of the blizzard." Moira nodded, her fingers wrapped around her teacup. "I knew it would come to this. When I heard they'd found a body in the snowman, I knew whose body it was. And I knew you'd come asking questions. Can you tell us about your relationship with Mr. Ross?" Hamish asked. "Relationship is too kind a word," Moira said with a bitter smile. "He wanted to demolish my home. This cottage, where I've lived for 40 years, where my husband and I built our life together. Ross's development plan showed holiday flats right where we're sitting now. He'd already served me with an eviction notice, claiming he'd found some legal technicality that invalidated the Kirk's trust arrangement. That must have made you very angry," Jimmy said. "Angry?" Moira's laugh was sharp. "I was furious, detective. I'm not ashamed to admit it. This cottage is all I have left of my life with Duncan. My husband Duncan, not that developer Ross. This is where we were happy, where we planned to grow old together before the sea took him. The thought of it being demolished for holiday flats, for wealthy tourists to stay in for a week at a time, it broke my heart and enraged me in equal measure." "Were you at the Kirk session meeting on the first night of the blizzard?" Hamish asked. "I was not invited," Moira said. "It was a session meeting, and I'm not an elder. But I knew about it. Everyone in the village knew Ross was coming to make his pitch. I watched from my window as the elders arrived, saw Ross's black BMW pull up at exactly 7 o'clock. He was always precisely on time, I'll give him that." "What did you do during the meeting?" Jimmy asked. "I practiced the organ," Moira said. "It's what I always do when I'm troubled. Music soothes me in a way nothing else can." The Kirk was dark except for the lights in the hall where the meeting was happening, but I know the organ well enough to play without much illumination. I must have practiced for 2 hours, maybe more. "So you were in the Kirk while the meeting was happening?" Hamish asked carefully. From the Kirk's interior, the organ loft had a view of the side entrance, the one closest to where Ross's body had been found. "Yes," Moira admitted. "I saw Ross leave around 8 o'clock. He slammed the hall door so hard I could hear it over my playing. I watched him storm out toward the car park, his coat collar up against the snow. And then, what happened?" Jimmy leaned forward. Moira was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He didn't reach his car. He stopped by the Kirk wall right where all that snow had drifted. I thought perhaps he was going to vandalize something, leave some cruel message. So I went out to confront him." "You went outside? In the blizzard?" Hamish felt his heart sink. "I put on my coat and boots and went out the side entrance," Moira continued. "By the time I reached him, he was talking on his mobile phone. I could hear his voice carried on the wind, something about lawyers and court orders and demolishing old women's homes." "What happened then, Moira?" Jimmy asked gently. "We argued," she said simply. "I told him he was a cruel man trying to destroy something beautiful for profit. He told me I was a sentimental old fool living in the past. He said progress was inevitable, and I should accept it gracefully." "Gracefully," she repeated with venom. "As if there's anything graceful about destroying someone's home. Did the argument become physical?" Hamish had to ask, though he dreaded the answer. "No," Moira said firmly. "I may have been angry enough to strike him, but I didn't. We shouted at each other for perhaps 5 minutes, maybe less. The wind was howling, the snow was blinding. Finally, he turned away from me in disgust and walked toward the drift by the Kirk wall. I think he was looking for a shortcut to the car park. And then... She stopped, her composure finally cracking. Tears ran down her lined face. "Take your time," Hamish said gently. "He slipped," Moira said. The ground beneath the snow was icy, treacherous. His feet went out from under him, and he fell backward. I heard the sound of his head hitting the Kirk wall, a terrible crack that carried even over the wind. He collapsed into the snowdrift and didn't move. I called to him, but he didn't respond. I went to him, checked for a pulse. There was nothing. He was dead." The room fell silent except for the crackling fire and Moira's quiet sobbing. Hamish exchanged a look with Jimmy, both of them processing this confession. "What did you do then?" Jimmy asked. Moira wiped her eyes. "I panicked. I knew how it would look. An old woman who'd been threatened with eviction, alone with the man threatening her, and now he's dead at her feet. Who would believe it was an accident? Who would believe I hadn't pushed him? So you covered him with snow, Hamish said. It wasn't a question. The drift was already deep, Moira said, and more snow was falling every minute. I started packing snow over him. It was surprisingly easy. The wind was doing half the work for me, piling snow against the wall. Within an hour, he was completely buried. I told myself I'd report it after the storm, say I'd found him frozen. But then more snow fell, and more, and I thought perhaps he wouldn't be found until spring. Perhaps never. And you didn't count on young Robbie McLeod building his prize-winning snowman right on top of the body, Jimmy said. I nearly fainted when I saw that snowman, Moira admitted. When Robbie won the contest, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. All I could do was pray the cold weather would last, that the snow wouldn't melt before I figured out what to do. Hamish stood, his heart heavy. Moira McLeod, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Duncan Ross. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you don't mention something you later rely on in court. Moira stood as well, with a dignity that broke Hamish's heart. It was an accident, she said quietly. I didn't kill him, but I did hide his body, and I suppose that's crime enough. Let me get my coat. Chapter 5. The Question of Evidence. The Strathbane Police Station's interview room was a bleak box painted institutional green, with a table bolted to the floor and 2 chairs that had seen better days. Hamish stood outside the observation window, watching as Blair conducted the formal interview with Moira McLeod. Her solicitor, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen Drummond from Inverness, sat beside her client with a protective air. Blair was in full prosecution mode, his voice booming through the thin walls. So, you admit you were present when Duncan Ross died? You admit you hid his body? You admit you hoped he wouldn't be found until spring, if ever? Moira's voice came through more quietly. I admit all of that, Detective Chief Inspector. What I don't admit is murder. Duncan Ross slipped on the ice and struck his head on the Kirk wall. It was a tragic accident, nothing more. A convenient accident, Blair sneered, for a woman about to lose her home. Helen Drummond intervened smoothly. My client has been entirely forthcoming about what happened that night. She's explained that Mr. Ross's death was accidental, and that her subsequent actions were the result of panic and poor judgment, not criminal intent. Poor judgment? Blair's face was reddening. She buried a man in snow and said nothing while the entire village searched for him, while his family worried, while police resources were wasted. That's not poor judgment, that's consciousness of guilt. Hamish moved away from the window and found Jimmy Anderson in the corridor, nursing a cup of terrible station coffee. How's it going? Jimmy asked. Blair's convinced she's lying, that she killed Ross deliberately, and the accident story is just a convenient cover, Hamish said. And maybe he's right. We only have Moira's word for what happened. But you don't believe she's lying, Jimmy observed. Hamish had been his friend long enough that Jimmy could read him easily. I don't know what I believe, Hamish admitted. I've known Moira for years. She's a gentle soul, devoted to her music and her kirk. But people can surprise you, especially when they're backed into a corner. The threat of losing her home, her memories of her husband, that could push anyone to desperate acts. Dr. Chen appeared at the end of the corridor, a file folder in her hands. Her expression was unreadable as she approached. I have the preliminary post-mortem results, she said. And they're interesting. Both detectives straightened. Go on, Jimmy said. Cause of death was definitely the head trauma, Dr. Chen began. Massive skull fracture consistent with striking the back of the head on a hard surface. The angle and nature of the injury are consistent with a backward fall, as Mrs. McLeod described. But, Hamish heard the unspoken qualification. But, Dr. Chen continued, there are some additional findings. Ross had elevated blood alcohol, 0.08, which would have affected his balance and judgment. More significantly, there are no defensive wounds on his hands or arms, nothing to suggest he tried to catch himself or push anyone away. If someone had struck him from behind or pushed him, you'd expect to see some evidence of a struggle. So, the accident story holds up medically? Jimmy asked. It's consistent with the physical evidence, Dr. Chen said carefully. That doesn't prove it's true, only that it could be true. The slippery conditions, the alcohol in his system, the position of the body and the drift, all of it supports an accidental fall, but it also doesn't rule out deliberate action. A well-placed push at the right moment would look exactly like this. It's the perfect crime in some ways, Hamish said slowly. The blizzard provides cover, the snow provides concealment, and the circumstances allow for reasonable doubt. Except that Mrs. MacLeod confessed, Jimmy pointed out. If she'd kept quiet, we might never have known she was there. The guilt of it was eating at her, Hamish said. I could see it in her face when we arrived at her cottage. She was almost relieved to tell someone. That's going to work against her in court, Dr. Chen observed. A jury might think she confessed because she was guilty of murder, not just concealment. Blair emerged from the interview room looking frustrated. She's sticking to her story. Accident, panic, poor judgment. Her solicitor is already talking about manslaughter charges at worst, possibly even just improper disposal of remains. What are you going to charge her with, sir? Jimmy asked. Murder, Blair said flatly. She had motive, means and opportunity. She admits being present when Ross died, and admits hiding the body. Whether she pushed him or he fell, her actions afterwards show consciousness of guilt. I'm recommending she be remanded in custody until trial. Hamish felt a protest rising, but swallowed it. Blair was technically right, even if Hamish's gut said Moira was telling the truth. In the absence of witnesses or video evidence, the case would come down to whether a jury believed her story or thought she was covering up murder. As Moira was led away to the cells, she caught Hamish's eye through the corridor window. Her expression wasn't angry or betrayed, just infinitely sad. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement if not absolution, and she turned away. We need to dig deeper, Hamish said to Jimmy as they walked to the station's car park. Talk to everyone who knew Ross, everyone who had dealings with him. If Moira's story's true, there should be corroborating evidence. Ross's phone records, witnesses who saw him drinking before the meeting, something. And if her story isn't true, Jimmy asked. Then we need to find proof of that too, Hamish said. Either way, we need more than just her confession and the physical evidence. We need the truth. The drive back to Lochdubh was quiet, lugs asleep on the passenger seat, the Highland landscape scrolling past in shades of grey and white. Hamish thought about Moira, about the cottage behind the kirk where she'd lived with her husband, about the music she played to soothe her troubled soul. He thought about justice and mercy, about the difference between accident and murder, about the weight of proof beyond reasonable doubt. By the time he reached Lochdubh, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed incongruous with the day's grim events. The village looked peaceful, innocent, a place where terrible things shouldn't happen. But they did happen, even here. Perhaps especially here, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where old grudges could simmer for years, where desperation could drive good people to terrible acts. Chapter 6. Shadows of Doubt. The next morning dawned grey and wet, the snow finally surrendering to rain that fell in steady sheets. Hamish stood at his kitchen window, watching the melt reveal the muddy reality beneath winter's white disguise. His tea had gone cold in his hand, his mind too occupied with Moira MacLeod's case to notice. Lugs nudged his leg, a reminder that breakfast was overdue. Hamish absently filled the dog's bowl and made himself some toast he had no appetite for. The arrest had sent shockwaves through Lochdubh. Half the village believed Moira incapable of murder. The other half remembered old stories about still waters running deep. His mobile phone rang. It was Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife, her voice tight with distress. "Hamish, you need to come to the manse. Reverend Macpherson has something he needs to tell you. Something about that night." 20 minutes later, Hamish sat in the manse's comfortable study, facing a minister who looked like he hadn't slept. Reverend Macpherson's normally cheerful face was drawn, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles showed white. "I should have spoken up yesterday," the minister said, "when you were interviewing the session members, but I was afraid. Afraid of how it would look, what people would think. But I can't let Moira face a murder charge when I know something that might help her." "What do you know, Reverend?" Hamish asked gently. Macpherson took a shaky breath. "After the session meeting ended, after everyone else had left, I stayed behind to lock up the hall. It was about 9 o'clock. maybe a few minutes passed. The blizzard was terrible, visibility almost zero. As I was locking the door, I heard shouting coming from near the kirk wall. 2 voices, one male, one female. Ross and Moira, Hamish said. I didn't know that at the time, the minister continued. I couldn't make out words, just angry voices. I thought about investigating, but the weather was so bad, and I assumed it was just someone trying to find shelter from the storm. I locked up and went into the manse through the connecting door. I never went outside, never saw who was arguing. And then what? Hamish prompted. About 15 minutes later, maybe 20, I looked out the window, the one in my study that faces the kirk garden. The snow was still falling heavily, but there was a figure moving near the kirk wall. Just one figure, not 2. They seemed to be, I don't know, working at something, moving snow around, but the visibility was so poor I couldn't tell who it was or what they were doing. Could you tell if it was a man or a woman? Hamish asked. No, Macpherson admitted. They were bundled up against the cold, bent over. It could have been anyone. After a few minutes, the figure was gone, swallowed by the storm. I thought perhaps it was Ian Mackay, checking that the snow hadn't damaged anything. I thought no more about it until yesterday. Why didn't you mention this during your interview? Hamish asked, though he knew the answer. The minister's face flushed with shame. Because when I heard Moira had been arrested, I realised that figure might have been her, burying Duncan Ross's body. And if I admitted I'd seen someone but done nothing, it would look like I was covering for her. Or worse, that I was somehow involved. I was a coward, Hamish. I put my reputation ahead of the truth. Your testimony could help Moira, Hamish said thoughtfully. It confirms her timeline that Ross died between 8 and 9:15, and it confirms someone was alone out there, which fits her story of panicking and hiding the body. But it also doesn't prove she didn't push him. I know, Macpherson said miserably. But surely it's better than nothing. Surely it shows she's been truthful about being there. Hamish stood to leave, then paused. One more question, Reverend. In all your dealings with Ross, in the meeting that night, did he seem intoxicated at all? The post-mortem showed he'd been drinking. The minister thought for a moment. He did have whiskey on his breath when he arrived. Not drunk, certainly, but he'd had a few drams. I remember thinking it was odd coming to a business meeting slightly oiled. He was steady on his feet, spoke clearly, but yes, he'd definitely been drinking. This was useful information. Hamish thanked the minister and promised to pass everything along to the investigating team. As he left the manse, he found himself no longer alone. The Curry sisters materialised from the rain like twin wraiths, their identical rain caps and macintoshes making them look more alike than ever. Constable Macbeth, Nessie Curry began in her penetrating voice. We have information about that dreadful night. Information, her sister Jessie echoed dutifully. Hamish suppressed a sigh. The Curry sisters had opinions about everything and information about nothing, but policy required he listen. What is it you want to tell me? Nessie drew herself up importantly. We saw Duncan Ross that afternoon before the blizzard really hit. He was at the hotel bar, drinking heavily and making phone calls. Shouting, really. We could hear him from the lounge. Shouting, Jessie confirmed. What was he saying? Hamish asked, his interest sharpening. Something about lawyers and court orders and teaching people a lesson, Nessie said. He was very red in the face, very aggressive. Not the sort of man you'd want to meet in a dark alley. Or a blizzard. Not in a blizzard, Jessie agreed. Hamish thanked them and continued on to the hotel. The Lochdubh Hotel was owned by Priscilla Halberton Smythe, a woman Hamish had complicated feelings about, but she was away in London on business. The hotel manager, Mr. Johnson, confirmed Ross had been drinking in the bar from about 4 until 6:30 on the night of his death. 3 large whiskies, Mr. Johnson said, consulting his records. He was on his mobile phone most of the time, seemed agitated. Paid cash and left at 6:30, said he had a meeting at the Kirk. Did he seem impaired? Hamish asked. He was steady enough, but definitely affected. I remember thinking he shouldn't be driving in that weather, but he was leaving the car and walking to the Kirk, so I didn't say anything. Each piece of information painted a clearer picture of Duncan Ross's final hours. A man who'd been drinking, who was agitated and aggressive, who'd gone into a contentious meeting slightly intoxicated. A man whose judgment would have been impaired, whose balance might have been affected, who might well have slipped on ice and fallen to his death. but it also painted a picture of a man who'd made himself vulnerable, easy prey for someone desperate enough to take advantage. Hamish drove back to the kirk, parking in the now mostly clear car park. The rain had washed away the last of the snow, revealing muddy ground and dead grass. The tarpaulin still covered the spot where Robbie's snowman had stood, a grim reminder of what had been found there. Ian Mackay, the kirk sexton, was cleaning debris from the kirk steps. He was a solid man in his 50s, taciturn by nature, who'd maintained the kirk grounds for 20 years. Hamish had known him to be reliable, hard-working and fiercely protective of his domain. "Mr. Mackay," Hamish called. "A moment of your time?" The sexton straightened, his weathered face neutral. "Constable. Terrible business, all this. Hard to believe, miss. MacLeod is in jail for murder." "Did you see or hear anything unusual the night of the blizzard?" Hamish asked. "You were here early the next morning clearing snow. Did you notice anything then?" Mackay leaned on his shovel, considering. "I was here at dawn, yes. Always am after a big snow. Need to clear the steps before anyone arrives for morning prayers. The drift by the kirk wall was massive, biggest I'd seen in years. But I didn't disturb it. No need to. It wasn't blocking anything." "Did you see the snowman Robbie built the next day, before the body was discovered?" "Aye," Mackay said. "Fine piece of work for a lad his age. I watched him building it that morning. He worked fast, had it done in a couple of hours. Never suspected there was anything inside beyond snow and ice." Hamish studied the sexton's face, looking for any sign of deception or guilt, but Mackay met his gaze steadily, showing nothing but honest bewilderment at the situation. As Hamish walked back to his Land Rover, his mobile phone rang again. It was Jimmy Anderson, his voice excited. "We've got Ross's phone records. You're not going to believe who he called that night." Chapter 7. Hidden Connections. Jimmy Anderson spread the phone records across Hamish's kitchen table, his finger tracing a series of calls made on the night of Duncan Ross's death. "Look at this pattern. Ross made 11 calls between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. Most were to his office in Strathbane, a few to his solicitor. But 3 calls, all made between 7:30 and 8:15, went to the same mobile number." "Whose number?" Hamish asked, leaning in to look. "That's the interesting part," Jimmy said. "The number belongs to Ian Mackay, the kirk sexton." Hamish felt his stomach tighten. What were they talking about? We don't know yet. But here's where it gets more interesting. Jimmy pulled out another document. "I did some digging into Ross's development plans. The plans he filed with the planning office show the kirk grounds development, but there was a secondary proposal. A kickback scheme, essentially. Ross was offering Mackay £20,000 to provide access and information about the kirk's trust documents. There's a contract, signed by both of them. Mackay was helping Ross." Hamish couldn't hide his surprise. "But he's devoted to the kirk. He's been sexton for 20 years. 20 years on a sexton's salary," Jimmy said pointedly. "I checked. Mackay's wife has MS, needs expensive care that the NHS doesn't fully cover. He's been struggling financially for years. £20,000 would make a real difference." "So Ross calls Mackay 3 times during and after the kirk session meeting," Hamish said slowly. "What was so urgent? Was Mackay supposed to do something that night?" "Maybe," Jimmy said. "Or maybe Ross was panicking after the session rejected his proposal. Maybe he wanted Mackay to help him with some kind of backup plan." "We need to talk to Mackay again," Hamish said, "and this time we need to push. Harder." They found Ian Mackay in the kirk itself, polishing the brass candlesticks with careful attention. The kirk was empty except for the 3 of them, the space filled with that peculiar silence that churches have, half peaceful and half oppressive. "Mr. Mackay," Jimmy began formally, "we need to ask you about your relationship with Duncan Ross." The sexton's hands stilled on the brass. His face went carefully blank. "I had no relationship with Ross." "That's odd," Jimmy continued, "because phone records show he called you 3 times on the night he died, and we have a contract showing he was paying you £20,000 to help with his development plans." The candlestick clattered to the floor. Mackay made no move to retrieve it. He stood there, his face now showing the strain he'd been hiding. "Aye," he said finally. "Aye, he was paying me. And God forgive me, I needed the money. My wife, my Ellen, she's getting worse. The treatment she needs, the special equipment, it's bankrupting us. When Ross approached me with his offer, I thought, just this once, I could do something that wasn't quite right for the right reasons. What did Ross want you to do? Hamish asked gently. Access to the Kirk's records, Mackay said. The trust documents, the property deeds, anything that might help him find a legal way to develop the land. I gave him copies of everything. I thought, the Kirk will be fine. It's survived worse than this. But Ellen needs help now. And the phone calls that night, Jimmy pressed. What did Ross want? Mackay sank onto a pew, his face grey. He was furious after the session meeting, called me 3 times. The first call he was angry, said he needed me to do something. Break into the Kirk office and get more documents, he said. Prove the session elders had no legal standing to reject his proposal. Did you agree? Hamish asked. The sexton shook his head. I told him no. It was one thing to give him copies of public records, another to commit breaking and entering. He called back 20 minutes later, even angrier. Said I'd already taken his money. I had to honour the deal or he'd expose me. Ruin my reputation. Get me fired. And the third call? Mackay's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He said if I didn't help him, he'd make sure Ellen lost her disability benefits. Said he had connections, could prove I'd been defrauding the system by not declaring income. It was a lie, but who would believe me over a wealthy developer? What time was this third call? Jimmy asked. The sexton pulled out his mobile phone, checked the log. 8:13 p.m. We argued for maybe 5 minutes. He was shouting so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Finally, I hung up on him. I'd had enough. Where were you when you took these calls? Hamish asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Mackay met his eyes. I was here, in the Kirk. I'd come to think, to pray maybe. I do that sometimes when I'm troubled. The Kirk was dark, quiet. I didn't know Moira was in the organ loft until I heard music starting after Ross's second call. Did you see Ross after the third call? Hamish pressed. Did you go outside? No, Mackay said firmly. I stayed in the Kirk for another hour, sitting in the dark, thinking about what I'd done, thinking about Ellen and what my stupidity might cost us. Around 9:30 I left through the front entrance and went home. I never saw Ross again. Why didn't you tell us this before? Jimmy demanded. A man is dead, and you've been withholding crucial information. Because I was afraid, Mackay said simply. Afraid you'd think I killed him. Afraid you'd tell everyone about the money, about my arrangement with Ross. Afraid I'd lose everything, my job, my reputation, the care for my wife. When I heard Moira had been arrested, I thought, at least someone else is taking the blame. I could keep silent and survive. But your silence means Moira might be convicted of a murder she may not have committed, Hamish said, his voice sharp. Your silence makes you complicit. I know, Mackay said miserably. I've barely slept since the arrest. Ellen keeps asking what's wrong, and I can't tell her. Can't tell her that I betrayed the Kirk for money, that I might have information that could help Moira, but I'm too much of a coward to come forward. Jimmy stood, his expression hard. Ian Mackay, you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence. As they led Mackay from the Kirk, Hamish saw movement in the organ loft. A face appeared briefly, then withdrew. Someone had been listening to the entire conversation, and Hamish had a sinking feeling he knew who it was. He took the stairs to the organ loft 2 at a time. Morag Finlay, a young woman who'd recently started training as assistant organist, sat on the organ bench, her face pale, her hands clasped in her lap. How much did you hear? Hamish asked, not unkindly. All of it, Morag admitted. I've been practicing for Sunday's service. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but once you started talking, I couldn't exactly announce my presence without making it worse. Did you see or hear anything the night of the blizzard? Hamish asked. Were you here then? Morag shook her head. No, I was home that night. But I saw something the next morning that I didn't understand at the time. I came early to practice, around 7 a.m. Mr. Mackay was already here, clearing snow from the steps like he said. But he kept looking over at that drift by the Kirk wall, just staring at it with this strange expression on his face. Strange how? Hamish pressed. Like he was worried about something? like he was trying to decide something. I asked if everything was all right, and he jumped like I'd startled him. Said he was fine, just tired from the storm. But he seemed nervous, distracted. Did you see him go near the drift? Touch it at all? No, Morag said. But after I went inside to practice, I looked out the window once. He was standing by the drift, just standing there in the snow. Then Robbie MacLeod arrived and started building his snowman, and Mr. Mackay walked away. Hamish thanked Morag and returned to where Jimmy was loading Mackay into the police car. The sexton sat in the back seat, his head in his hands, a broken man who'd made terrible choices for understandable reasons. "We need to reconsider everything," Hamish said to Jimmy. Mackay had motive to want Ross dead. £20,000 he'd already taken, a threat to expose him hanging over his head. And he admits being in the kirk during the crucial time period. But he says he never went outside, Jimmy pointed out. And we have no proof he did. We have no proof he didn't either, Hamish countered. He could have left through a side door, confronted Ross, killed him, or watched him fall, then returned to the kirk. Moira's testimony puts Ross alive at the kirk wall around 8:15. Mackay's third call ended at 8:18. That's a 3-minute window. You think Mackay killed Ross and Moira found the body after? Jimmy asked. I think it's possible, Hamish said. Or I think Mackay might have been there, might have seen what happened and kept silent because he was afraid of being implicated. Either way, his testimony could change everything about this case. As they drove back to Strathbane with their prisoner, Hamish looked out at the rain-soaked landscape. The truth was getting murkier, not clearer. The more they uncovered, the more questions arose. And somewhere in a cell, Moira MacLeod waited to learn if justice would prevail or if she would pay the price for a crime she may not have committed. Chapter 8. The Weight of Confession. The revelation of Iain Mackay's involvement sent fresh shockwaves through Lochdubh and complicated Blair's prosecution of Moira MacLeod considerably. Helen Drummond, Moira's solicitor, immediately filed a motion for reconsideration of the charges, arguing that new evidence suggested alternative suspects and timelines. Hamish found himself in the uncomfortable position of having potentially helped Moira while destroying another man's life. Mackay's arrest meant Ellen Mackay was now alone, her husband in custody, their future uncertain. The village was divided between those who sympathised with Mackay's desperate circumstances and those who saw his betrayal of the kirk as unforgivable. It was Dr. Brodie who called Hamish with the next piece of the puzzle. I've been thinking about the medical evidence. You should come to my surgery. There's something I want to show you. In Brodie's cluttered office, the doctor pulled out a file containing photographs from Ross's post-mortem. Look at the skull fracture. See the pattern? It's consistent with striking a flat, hard surface like the kirk wall. But look at this. He pointed to a detail in one of the photographs. There's a small amount of paint or plaster embedded in the wound. The forensics team tested it. It matches the kirk wall's exterior surface. Victorian-era lime plaster with traces of green paint, from restoration work done in 1987. So Ross definitely hit the kirk wall, Hamish said. That confirms the location. Yes, but here's what's interesting, Brodie continued. The angle of impact suggests he was falling backward and slightly to the left. If someone pushed him from behind, you'd expect him to fall straight back or forward. This trajectory is more consistent with losing balance and falling at an angle. Could he have been pushed from the side? Hamish asked. Possible, but there would likely be bruising or evidence of contact. The body shows no such marks. What we have is entirely consistent with an intoxicated man slipping on ice and falling badly. So Moira might be telling the truth, Hamish said slowly. It really could have been an accident. The medical evidence suggests it, Brodie confirmed. But that doesn't change the fact that she concealed the death and disposed of the body. The law doesn't look kindly on that, accident or not. Hamish left the surgery and drove out to the Mackay cottage on the edge of the village. Ellen Mackay answered the door in her wheelchair, her face drawn with worry but her spine straight with dignity. Constable Macbeth. I've been expecting you. Please, come in. The cottage was small but immaculate, filled with the medical equipment Ellen needed, and the careful tidiness of people living on limited means. Ellen gestured to a chair and positioned her wheelchair to face him. I know about the money, she said without preamble. Ian confessed everything to me last night before they took him away. 20 years of marriage and I had no idea he was capable of such deception. Not the taking of the money itself, I understand desperation, but the secrecy, the lies, the willingness to betray something he claimed to love. He did it for you, Hamish said gently, for your treatment, your care. Ellen's laugh was bitter. And that's supposed to make it noble? Constable, I would rather die with dignity than live with the shame of knowing my husband sold his honour for me. He never asked what I wanted. He decided, all by himself, that I was worth more than his integrity. Do you know if he left the kirk that night? Hamish asked, after Ross called him. Ellen shook her head. He came home around 10 o'clock, soaked through from the blizzard, shaking with cold. I asked where he'd been, and he said the kirk, that he'd been thinking and praying. He seemed troubled but wouldn't talk about it. Now I know why. Did he seem guilty? Afraid? Like he'd seen or done something terrible? Ellen considered carefully. He seemed defeated, broken almost, like a man who'd reached the end of something. I thought it was about my illness, the latest bad news from the doctors. I tried to comfort him, but he just held me and cried. My Ian, who never cries, sobbing in my arms like a child. Hamish left the Mackay cottage with a heavy heart. Whatever Ian Mackay had done or not done that night, he was clearly paying for it now. And his wife, innocent of any wrongdoing, was paying the highest price of all. At the Strathbane station, Jimmy Anderson had news. Mackay's made a full statement. Claims he never left the kirk, never saw Ross after the session meeting ended, never went near the drift. But here's the thing. Forensics found traces of lime plaster on Mackay's coat. The coat he was wearing that night. The same plaster from the kirk wall? Hamish asked, his pulse quickening. Same composition. Could be coincidence, he works around that kirk constantly. But it could also mean he was there, at the wall, at some point that night. They interviewed Mackay again, this time with Hamish present. The sexton looked diminished in the interview room, smaller somehow, as if confession had physically shrunk him. The plaster on your coat, Mr. Mackay, Hamish said. How did it get there? Mackay's hands trembled on the table. I did go outside. After the third call from Ross, I was so angry, so frightened, I needed air, needed to think. I went out the side door, the one closest to the organ loft. The wind was terrible, the snow blinding. I walked along the kirk wall, using it to steady myself. Did you see Duncan Ross? Jimmy demanded. Mackay was silent for a long moment. Yes, he was there, by the drift, and so was Moira. They were shouting at each other, though I could barely hear them over the wind. I stayed back, in the shadows by the kirk door. I didn't want to be seen. What happened then? Hamish leaned forward. They argued for maybe 5 minutes. Ross was gesturing angrily, Moira was crying and shouting. Then Ross turned away from her, started walking toward the drift. I thought he was leaving, going to his car. But his foot slipped. I saw it clearly. One moment he was upright, the next his legs went out from under him. He fell backward, hit his head on the wall with a crack I could hear even over the storm. Then he collapsed into the drift and didn't move. And Moira? What did she do? She went to him, knelt in the snow beside him. I could see her checking for a pulse, calling his name. Then she just froze there, kneeling beside the body. I waited, thinking she'd run for help, call someone. But instead she started pushing snow over him, covering him up. Why didn't you stop her? Why didn't you help? Hamish's voice was sharp. Because I was afraid, Mackay said miserably. Afraid of what Ross had on me, afraid of being connected to his death. If Moira was covering it up, that meant no investigation, no questions, no one discovering my arrangement with Ross. So I went back into the kirk, waited half an hour, then went home. I told myself it was an accident, that Moira had her reasons for concealing it, that it was none of my business. You let her take the blame, Jimmy said coldly. You watched her get arrested for murder when you knew it was an accident. I know, Mackay whispered. I've been a coward and a fool. But I swear on my wife's life, I didn't kill Duncan Ross. I saw him fall. I saw it was an accident. and I did nothing to help Moira because I was thinking only of myself. The statement changed everything. Within hours, Helen Drummond had secured Moira's release from custody. The charges against her were reduced from murder to interfering with a corpse and perverting the course of justice. Serious charges still, but not life imprisonment, not the stigma of being a killer. Hamish drove Moira back to Lochdubh, the countryside passing by in the grey afternoon light. She sat silently in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her hands folded in her lap. "I'm not innocent," she said finally, as they approached the village. "I did conceal his death. I did let days pass without reporting it. I let that poor boy build a snowman around a corpse. Those things are true, and I deserve punishment for them." "But you didn't kill him," Hamish said. "That's what matters most." "Does it?" Moira asked. "A man is still dead. His family has still lost him. The village is still torn apart, and I'm still the woman who hid a body and hoped it would never be found." Accident or murder, those facts don't change. They reached the kirk, where the organist's cottage sat dark and empty behind it. Moira looked at it with an expression Hamish couldn't quite read. "I don't know if I can stay here," she said softly. "Every time I look at that kirk wall, I'll see him falling. Every time I practice the organ, I'll think about what I did afterward. How can I make music in a place where I committed such a sin?" Hamish had no answer for that. Some stains, he knew, didn't wash clean with time or justice or even forgiveness. Some things, once done, changed a person forever. Chapter 9. The Unravelling Threads. The legal aftermath of Duncan Ross's death stretched through the winter and into early spring. Moira MacLeod entered a guilty plea to the reduced charges and received a suspended sentence along with 200 hours of community service. Ian Mackay was charged with conspiracy to defraud and received a similar suspended sentence, though he was dismissed from his position as kirk sexton. The £20,000 from Ross had to be returned to the developer's estate, leaving the Mackay family worse off than before. But it was Hamish who couldn't let go of the nagging feeling that something remained unresolved. On a grey March morning, he sat in his kitchen with Dr. Brodie, spreading out notes and photographs he'd been reviewing for weeks. "Look at the timeline," Hamish said, tapping the papers. Ross leaves the kirk session meeting at 8 p.m. He makes 3 calls to Mackay between 8:10 and 8:18. Moira goes outside to confront him around 8:15. They argue until approximately 8:25. Ross falls and hits his head. But here's what bothers me. Where was Ross for those first 15 minutes after he left the meeting? "Walking around in the blizzard," Brodie suggested. "Calming down after the contentious meeting." Maybe, but his car was in the car park, only 50 yards from the hall door. Why not go straight to it? Why stand around in a blizzard? Hamish pulled out his mobile and called Jimmy Anderson. "Can you check something for me? Ross's mobile phone records. I want to know if there were any calls between 8 and 8:10 that we haven't accounted for." 20 minutes later, Jimmy called back. "You were right to check. There was one more call we missed. At 8:05 p.m, Ross received a call from a landline. Duration 3 minutes 42 seconds. The number belongs to the Lochdubh Hotel." Hamish felt a jolt of certainty. Who at the hotel? "That's the interesting part," Jimmy said. "The call came from one of the guest rooms, room 7, to be specific, which was occupied that week by a woman named Fiona Ross." "A relative?" Hamish asked, though he already suspected the answer. "His daughter. She'd checked in the day before the blizzard, told the hotel staff she was there to support her father during his meeting with the kirk session. We never interviewed her because by the time we identified the body and started investigating, she'd checked out and returned to Edinburgh." Hamish and Jimmy drove to Edinburgh that afternoon, arriving at an expensive flat in the new town, just as the streetlights were coming on. Fiona Ross answered the door, a well-dressed woman in her early 40s with her father's sharp features and an air of controlled composure that faltered when she saw police identification. They sat in her elegant living room, and Hamish began gently. "You were in Lochdubh the night your father died. You called him at 8:05 p.m. What did you talk about?" Fiona's composure cracked completely. Tears welled in her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice shook. "I called to tell him I'd changed my mind, that I couldn't go through with it." "Go through with what, Miss Ross?" Jimmy asked. "The development. The whole project. I'd been researching Lochdubh, the kirk, the community. I talked to villagers, learned about the history, the trust, what the kirk grounds meant to people. And I realized my father was wrong. He was going to destroy something precious for profit. So you called to tell him this, Hamish prompted. Yes, I told him I wouldn't support the project, wouldn't provide the additional financing he needed. He was furious, said I was betraying him, that this was our chance to make serious money together. We argued for nearly 4 minutes. Then he hung up on me. What did you do then? Jimmy asked. Fiona wiped her eyes. I should have stayed in my room, should have let him cool down. But I was worried about him. He'd been drinking all afternoon and the storm was getting worse. I put on my coat and walked to the kirk, thinking I could find him, tried to talk more, calmly. What time did you arrive? Hamish leaned forward. Around 8:20, maybe 8:25. The blizzard was terrible, I could barely see, but I could hear shouting coming from near the kirk wall. 2 voices. I got closer and saw my father arguing with a woman. I didn't know it was the organist at the time. What did you do? I stayed back, out of sight. I didn't want to make things worse by interfering. I watched them argue, saw my father turn away, saw him slip and fall. God help me. I saw him hit his head and collapse into the snow, and I did nothing. The room fell silent, except for Fiona's quiet sobbing. Why didn't you help him? Jimmy asked, his voice hard. Why didn't you call for emergency services? Because I knew he was dead, Fiona said simply. I've been a nurse for 20 years. I could tell from the way he fell, the sound his head made hitting that wall, that there was no coming back from that. And I watched the woman, Moira, check for a pulse and find nothing. We both knew he was dead. But you still did nothing, Hamish said. You watched her cover the body with snow and said nothing. Fiona looked up, her face ravaged by guilt and grief. I told myself it was an accident, that reporting it wouldn't bring him back, that maybe it was even justice in a way. My father had hurt a lot of people in his career, destroyed communities for profit. Maybe this was how it was meant to end. And the money? Jimmy asked. You inherited his estate, his company. That's millions of pounds. Money I've been using to undo some of the damage he caused, Fiona said, with fierce intensity. I've donated to community trusts, bought back properties he developed improperly, funded legal challenges to projects he started. I can't bring him back, can't change what happened, but I can try to make his death mean something. Hamish studied her carefully. When did you leave Lochdubh? The next morning, as soon as the roads were passable. I couldn't stay, couldn't face what I'd seen. When the body was discovered, I thought about coming forward. But then Moira was arrested, and I told myself she'd confessed to the accident, that the truth would come out. When I heard she was charged with murder, I nearly broke. But I was a coward. I chose my freedom over justice. They arrested Fiona Ross for perverting the course of justice and being an accessory after the fact. As they led her from her flat, she looked back at the comfortable life she'd built on guilt and inheritance. I'm almost relieved, she said quietly. Living with this secret has been its own prison. At least now, the truth is finally complete. Chapter 10. The Settling Snow. Spring came slowly to Lochdubh, the long Highland winter reluctant to release its grip. But by April, the hills were green again, the loch sparkled in sunshine, and the kirk garden showed the first brave crocuses pushing through the earth where snow had once hidden death. Hamish stood in his usual spot at the kitchen window, lugs at his feet, watching the village wake up. The case of Duncan Ross's death was officially closed now, all the threads pulled until they unravelled completely. 3 people held responsible in varying degrees. Moira for concealment, Mackay for his corruption and silence, and Fiona Ross for her cowardice and complicity. But no one was held responsible for murder, because in the end, Blair had to accept what the evidence showed. Duncan Ross had died in an accident, his death the result of bad judgment, alcohol, treacherous conditions, and unfortunate timing. Sometimes, Hamish reflected, the truth was that simple and that complicated all at once. The kirk had a new organist now, a young man from Inverness who played competently but without Moira's particular grace. Moira herself had moved to stay with a sister in Aberdeen, unable to bear the weight of memory in Lochdubh. She'd written to Hamish once, a short letter thanking him for believing she hadn't committed murder, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Ellen Mackay still lived in the cottage at the village edge, but Iane had left Lochdubh the day after his sentencing, his note saying only that Ellen deserved better than a man who'd proven himself capable of betrayal. The village had rallied around Ellen, organising a fund to help with her medical care, proving that compassion could survive even in the aftermath of scandal. And Fiona Ross had received a 2-year sentence, suspended after 8 months for cooperation and her genuine remorse. She'd made good on her promise to use her inheritance for restitution, funding a permanent trust to preserve the Lochdubh Kirk grounds and providing a scholarship for local students pursuing music education in Moira's name. Hamish's mobile phone rang, pulling him from his reverie. It was Reverend Macpherson, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone determined to move forward. "Hamish, I wondered if you'd come by the kirk this morning. We're dedicating a memorial garden where the snowman stood, a place to remember that even from tragedy beauty can grow. I thought you should be there." Hamish agreed and made his way to the kirk an hour later. A small crowd had gathered in the garden, villagers who'd lived through the winter's events and wanted to mark its ending. The memorial was simple, a stone bench beneath a newly planted rowan tree, with a plaque reading, "In remembrance of sorrow, in hope of grace." Young Robbie MacLeod stood beside his parents, looking older than his 10 years, the boy who'd won a snowman contest he'd never forget. Hamish caught his eye and nodded, a gesture of solidarity and understanding. Some burdens we carry alone, but some we share, and sharing makes them lighter. After the brief ceremony, Hamish walked the kirk grounds with Dr. Brodie, both of them silent in the spring sunshine. "Do you think Moira will ever come back?" Brodie asked finally. "I don't know," Hamish admitted. "Some places hold too many ghosts. Sometimes starting over somewhere new is the only way forward." "And Mackay? Will Ellen take him back?" "I hope so. People make terrible choices for complicated reasons. Doesn't mean they're beyond redemption." They reached the wall where Duncan Ross had fallen, where snow had concealed and a child had inadvertently revealed. Fresh green ivy was already growing over the spot, nature reclaiming what winter had transformed into a crime scene. "It's the question of intent that haunts me," Brodie said thoughtfully. "If Moira had pushed Ross, if Mackay had struck him, if Fiona had hastened his fall, would it have been murder, or would it have been justice? The man was destroying lives and communities for profit." "The law doesn't recognise vigilante justice," Hamish said, "but I understand the question. Sometimes the victim isn't innocent, and that complicates everything." "But the law did work in the end," Brodie countered. "The truth came out. People were held accountable for their actions, if not for Ross's death, then for what they did afterward. That's something." Hamish nodded, but his mind was on all the ways the case could have gone differently. If Robbie had chosen a different spot for his snowman, if the weather had stayed cold longer, if Moira had found the courage to report the accident immediately, if Mackay had spoken up when he witnessed the fall, if Fiona had chosen truth over self-preservation. So many small choices, each one seeming insignificant at the time, each one leading inevitably to the moment when a child's joyful creation revealed death hidden in snow. That evening, Hamish sat in his kitchen with a dram of whiskey, lugs snoring by the fire. The case files were filed away, the official reports submitted, the legal consequences assigned and served. By any measure, he'd done his job. The truth had been uncovered, justice had been served in its imperfect way, and Lochdubh could move forward. But he thought about Moira, playing her organ in the dark, seeking solace in music while a man lay dying yards away. He thought about Mackay, torn between love for his wife and loyalty to his kirk, choosing the former and destroying both. He thought about Fiona, watching her father fall, and in that instant deciding that silence served a greater good than truth. And he thought about Duncan Ross himself, a man so focused on profit he couldn't see the value of what he was destroying until the moment the ground betrayed him, an ancient stone ended his ambitions forever. The case of the frozen snowman, as the newspapers had inevitably dubbed it, would be remembered in Lochdubh for generations. The winter, when death came hidden in snow, when a child's innocent joy revealed a community's darkest secrets, when accident and intent blurred until no one could quite say where one ended and the other began. A knock at the door interrupted Hamish's philosophical musings. He opened it to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe standing there, elegant as always, with a basket of something that smelled wonderful. "I thought you might need this," she said, holding out what proved to be Mrs. Wellington's meat pie. "After the winter we've all had, comfort food seemed appropriate." Hamish smiled and invited her in. They sat at his kitchen table, sharing the pie and talking of small things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation that reminded them both that life in Lochdubh was more than murder and mystery. "Do you ever regret it?" Priscilla asked eventually. "Staying here instead of taking promotions to bigger places, bigger cases?" Hamish looked around his small kitchen, at Lugs, sleeping peacefully, at the window framing the loch and hills beyond. "Sometimes," he admitted, "when cases like this one tear the village apart and leave scars that won't heal quickly. But then I remember that someone has to care about places like Lochdubh, about people like Moira and Ellen and even Mackay. Someone has to stand between the big world and the small one and try to make sure justice considers both." "That's rather philosophical for a Highland police constable," Priscilla observed with a smile. "Blame the weather. Long winters make a man thoughtful." After Priscilla left, Hamish stood at his door, looking out at Lochdubh under stars. The village was peaceful now, lights glowing in windows, smoke rising from chimneys. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new conflicts, perhaps even new crimes. But tonight, the case of the frozen snowman was truly closed, its truth revealed, its lessons learned, its ghosts laid to rest. He thought one last time of that magnificent snowman, Robbie MacLeod's prize-winning creation that had concealed death in its frozen heart. In a way, it was a perfect metaphor for Lochdubh itself. Beautiful on the surface, hiding complicated truths beneath, and requiring patience and warmth to reveal what lay within. The spring melt had revealed Duncan Ross's body, and the secrets surrounding his death. In time, perhaps, it would also wash away the pain and grief, leaving only the lessons and the memories. New snow would fall next winter, covering the scars, transforming the landscape once again into something beautiful and treacherous and mysterious. And Hamish would be here, watching over his village, ready for whatever secrets the next winter might reveal. Good night, my friends. This has been Stephen from Mindful Musings, sharing with you the tale of the frozen witness. I hope you've enjoyed this journey through mystery and revelation in the Highlands. If you'd like to join me for more stories like this, please subscribe and share with others who appreciate a good mystery. Until next time, stay curious, stay mindful, and remember that truth, like snow, eventually melts to reveal what lies beneath. Sleep well.